everybody. We got a great one today, for a change, because we got Frank Foer and David Rothkopf on Israel and Gaza and Hezbollah and Lebanon and Iran and the Houthis in Yemen. And we have climate scientist Michael Mann back to talk about hurricanes Helene and Milton and how just maybe they're a function of global warming or climate change. Those are the same things. The globe is getting warmer, according to Michael. So let's start with Michael. Hey, Mike.
Great to be with you, Al. Yep.
Just seemed like these two storms, Helene and Milton, may have been trying to tell us something. What do you suppose that is?
Yeah, I think they're trying to tell us to, first of all, during the home stretch of an election that will determine the future course of climate action in the U.S. and arguably internationally, this is an issue that you should be thinking about. Do you want a president who denies that climate change is real and wants to get rid of NOAA, the government agency that is actually responsible for sending out the hurricane hunters that make the measurements that we feed into the models so we can better predict the path and the intensity of the hurricane? And that would be axed under the Republican plan, Agenda 2025. So I think there's a clear political message and obviously the related message, we've got to get our act in gear. It's late in the game. We've got to reduce carbon emissions. We've got to get off fossil fuels.
Now, the path of Helene was much more dangerous. It went up into the mountains up in western North Carolina and into Tennessee, even, right?
Yeah. And in fact, Asheville, North Carolina, which was it was hit particularly hard. There are a couple ironies there, unfortunate ironies. Asheville, North Carolina is sort of a mecca now for retirees who are finding things too hot down in Florida, so it's becoming a more attractive place to retire. Sort of the idea that with sea level rise, with warming, sort of getting away from the impacts of climate change. But what this sort of latest event drives home is there is no getting away from the impacts of climate change. The other irony I was going to point out is Asheville is home of NOAA's climate data center, which would be eliminated again under the Republican plan.
How many billions of dollars in the Inflation Reduction Act were dedicated to addressing climate change?
I think it was something like $370 billion, as I recall. Better part of $500 billion.
Right. And yet, have we drilled more oil now? Are we doing more now than we ever have?
I'm not sure if we're doing more than we ever have, but we are continuing to drill, offshore oil drilling, obviously natural gas extraction. The United States, the rest of the world is continuing to extract and burn fossil fuels at a time when obviously we need to get away from that as quickly as possible.
Yeah, because I know the fact we've talked about whether natural gas is a good transition,
right?
And you've been against that.
Yeah, I call it a bridge to nowhere, right? It's often described as a bridge to a fossil-free future. It's a bridge to nowhere because it just continues our, reliance on fossil fuels. It's a fossil fuel. You burn it, you add to carbon pollution, you add to the climate problem.
And so these two hurricanes, is Milton just less powerful, or is it just that it went out to sea, went out the Atlantic Ocean?
Oh, in terms of why didn't it have the flooding impact or? Yeah, it was the trajectory. I mean, it moved pretty quickly. It went across the Florida Peninsula and out to sea. That's the good news. The bad news is I think there was a 14-foot storm surge in Sarasota. And if you've seen some of the images, it was devastating for the people on the west coast of Florida that saw the storm surge, that saw the extreme wind damage. This thing was a Cat 5 monster at one point, possibly, and I think they're going to analyze the data at the end of the season. They always go back and make sure. I think that this might have been 190 miles per hour at its peak. That would make it the highest wind speeds we've ever seen with an Atlantic hurricane. And one other thing, we saw it intensify from a tropical depression to a Cat 5 hurricane in 48 hours. We've never seen that sort of intensification.
Now, is this because the water in the Atlantic or in the Gulf there is warmer?
Yeah, I mean, it's really simple physics. More warmth, more energy to intensify these storms. The faster they intensify, the higher the intensities that they reach.
Well, thanks. This is uh, everything you've been talking about is happening, I guess.
Well, it as a colleague of mine once said. The last thing you want to see as a climate scientist is your predictions come true, and unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. That's the bad news. The good news is and every time we talk, I make it very clear it's not too late. It is not too late. The obstacles aren't technological at this point. They're not physical. We can still limit warming to far more catastrophic levels. We talk about 1.5 Celsius, 3 Fahrenheit, where things get really bad. We can still avoid that if we have the political will. And I want people to be thinking about that as they vote this fall, because there are two paths. There's a fork in the road here. One is down a path of denialism, doubling down on fossil fuels, accelerating the climate crisis. The other, Harris, the Democrats, is a path of building on the progress that we've already made under the current administration. The Inflation Reduction Act puts us starts to move us in the right direction, but we still have to move far faster than we're moving. We have to build on that progress, and Kamala Harris and Democrats will make sure that happens.
Let's hope so. Okay, let's. I'm nervous about it all.
Well, if you're not nervous, you're not paying attention. But yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
Always great to talk. Hope to talk again soon.
Thanks, Michael. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Israel and Gaza and the region with Frank Foer and David Rothkopf. Well, we're back with our friends Frank Foer of the Atlantic and David Rothkopf. David is an American foreign policy and national security and political affairs analyst and commentator and writer for The Daily Beast. Frank, in your piece, the war that would not end, it didn't seem like it was for want of trying.
Well, there's been a lot of energetic, earnest diplomacy in the quest of ending this war, bringing the hostages home. Joe Biden has spent a lot of time trying to prevent the war in Gaza from spilling over to Israel's northern border and then to a broader war with Iran. So there's been a lot of effort, but not that much to show for it, sadly. Evidently, right? Because there is no hostage deal, there is no ceasefire, and the war is spilling over.
David, is there something that Biden should be doing and should have been doing earlier? He stopped sending the 2,000-pound bombs for a brief period and now has restored that. I haven't seen anything that we've done aggressively to end this war. Your piece was all about aggressive attempts to end the war.
I think there's a lot we should have done. I don't know how much it would have changed the behavior of the Israelis.
Mm-hmm.
There's a tendency when we have discussions like this in the United States to think, well, if we do X, Y, and Z, we will change this international situation.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is we have limited amount of influence. Bibi Netanyahu has regularly ignored the requests of the United States and has, regularly taunted the U.S. to do more, to influence him. And we know it won't. We don't influence the Hamas. We don't influence Hezbollah. We don't even influence the Iranians that much. Although maybe we may paradoxically have more influence over them than we do over Netanyahu. But changing the behavior of Netanyahu is not the only reason to use the leverage we have. Another reason to use the leverage, not supply arms, for example, is because we don't want to be complicit in mass murder. And that it's not in the United States' interests to be complicit in mass murder. And so, sometimes, might that influence the Israelis somewhat? Sure, it might somewhat. But in this particular case, I think we also have to look at the fact that Netanyahu's actually doing a little better politically the deeper he gets into this horror. His coalition's a little bigger. He's still in power. And it's very clear, I think, that he thinks the more he does like this, the more solidly he remains in control in Israel.
Al, can I just respond to a couple things there? Jump in. I agree with David that there's limits to what American leverage can achieve. In fact, there are some pretty clear textbook examples from recent American foreign policy where we tried to cut off military aid to Egypt or to Bahrain, and it did nothing to change their policy to accord with U.S. interests or wishes, because when a nation is fighting for what it perceives to be its survival, or government is fighting for its survival, it doesn't really matter if the U.S. stops sending arms in one way, shape, or form or another. So I do think that there is this fantasy that there's a switch that could be flipped.
So you think that if they had stopped sending weapons, that would have had no effect?
We don't know, but I think that history suggests that it's unlikely to have an effect, and because Israel isn't just fighting this war because it sees it as an optional exercise. It feels as if it's fighting for its survival. And it's not just Benjamin Netanyahu who feels that way. It's the vast, vast majority of the Israeli public. I would also say that you have to squint sometimes to see the administration's achievements in Gaza. But over time, because of pressure that the administration applied in a kind of cooperative, sometimes Socratic sort of way, it was able to change the conduct of the Israeli campaign in Gaza. So there's a pretty big difference between the way that the campaign in Gaza City was fought, where there was fairly indiscriminate bombing, and then the way in which the battle for Rafah was fought, which there were way fewer civilian casualties.
Yeah, but you'd think that even if it doesn't have an effect, that withholding weapons would be sending a message, not just to the Israelis, but to the world. Am I wrong?
You could I think David is making the best case for it, which is that we could argue the merits of it, but there's a moral case to be made for withholding arms that's, I think, stronger than the strategic case to be made.
We've sent Israel $18 billion in arms since this started, $17.9 billion in arms. What Israel has done with those things is horrific. I totally agree with Frank's point about, if you squint, you will see some consequences of the really incredible diplomacy, tireless Secretary Blinken, CIA Director Bill Burns, of a whole host of people in this administration. It's had some effect, but 42,000 people are dead in Gaza. 100,000 people almost are injured. The Lancet, the British publication, suggests that maybe as many as 100,000 people are dead in Gaza. Many, 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 the vast majority of those people are innocents. Many are children. And no matter what the United States does or says, this will always be on this administration.
I just want to add, though, that it's a two-sided war. And that, part of the reason that these damages, so many civilians are killed, is because Israel is waging battle against an enemy that basically hides among civilians, and that if Hamas wanted to cut a ceasefire deal, I'm not saying it necessarily could, because it takes two sides, but they've also been an obstacle to a ceasefire deal throughout these proceedings.
Yeah, of course, they're terrorists. They're terrible people. Now, we've seen in the case of Hezbollah, for example, in Lebanon, that the Israelis were much more effective at targeting them and eliminating them in just a couple of weeks, the whole leadership of Hezbollah, than they were in the case of Hamas. Is that because the Mossad was handling Lebanon and the Shin Bet was handling Gaza, and one's better than the other? I don't know. But clearly there are ways to target terrorists that are more efficient, and there are ways to target terrorists that are deliberately less efficient because they are trying to send a message. And if you take the behavior of the Israelis with regard to innocents in Gaza, and then listen to the extreme members of the Netanyahu administration, they are talking about eliminating Gaza. They are talking about turning it into Israel. They are talking about getting rid of the people of Gaza. They're talking about ethnic cleansing. And we can't just, suggest because sometimes Netanyahu in English says something that's not quite that awful, that's not what their goal is.
Well, let's talk about Hezbollah and how they took out the leader, Nasrallah. Is that his name?
Hassan Nasrallah.
And then they just took out the next leader. Is that right?
I mean, yes, they did take out the next leader. I don't know if they took out the leader after that.
Okay.
But there's been what they call in clinical military terms decapitation.
Now, it's just because they don't have tunnels under there where they are, or how did they get Nasrallah? They just bombed the hell out of it where he was, right?
David asked this question, which I think is a fairly fair question to ask, which is, how could Israel have failed to foresee the October 7th attack, and how could they have no plan on the shelf for invading Gaza, and how could they have all these security lapses as it relates to Hamas? But then they spent 10, 15 years intricately planning for a war against Hezbollah, and that they, the pager operation, I think, will go down in history as one of the great operations that was ever pulled off, because it took so long for them to implant themselves in the various supply chains and the like. And clearly there's incredible infiltration of either Hezbollah's communications or the Hezbollah leadership itself that has supplied it with this intelligence that's allowed it to achieve these successes, which stand in such striking contrast to the performance in Gaza.
Yeah, and we're also, we're sort of in early days. They made this efficient move against the top people in Hezbollah, and they have, as Frank says, decapitated it. But then they've made this sort of classic Israeli error of going into Lebanon with greater force. The Israelis call it an incursion. Lebanese call it an invasion. And in the past, that has led them to get bogged down. It has led to a lot of civilian deaths. It's led to a lot of resentment among the Lebanese. And whereas Hezbollah may not be, placing themselves in tunnels under, hospitals like Hamas is alleged to have done, there are all sorts of Hezbollah has,
I think it's beyond alleged. They have done that.
No. Well, they have in some cases, but in some cases they fabricated stories about
Okay.
what the complexes were under which hospitals. But my point was that Hezbollah has also buried lots of weapons all over Lebanon, and there's plenty of reason to go and destroy Lebanese towns, villages, parts of cities, in order to destroy those weapons caches. There's a reason that in international law, countries are proscribed, from reckless killing of civilians. There is an obligation to ensure that civilians are taken care of. And clearly, that has not been an Israeli priority. It's not a Hamas priority. It's not a Hezbollah priority. So let's spread the blame around. But Hamas and Hezbollah are also, despite what everybody says, vastly inferior military organizations to the IDF. We hear a lot about, Hamas was firing all these missiles at Israel for the past, 10 years. How many civilian casualties resulted from those Hamas missiles? Almost none. Same with Hezbollah.
I agree with much of what David says, but I also think that, it's, at least with Hezbollah, let's start with Hezbollah, that there was a significant portion of the Israeli population that was forced to evacuate their homes because missiles were being fired on them by Hezbollah. And it wasn't as if Israel had done anything to ignite the first salvos that Hezbollah fired on them on October 8th.
No question. But what sticks in my craw on a regular basis is disproportionality. 60,000 Israelis were forced to relocate out of northern Israel. We're well over 1 million and heading towards 2 million Lebanese being forced to dislocate themselves. 1,400 Israelis were killed on October 7th. Between 40 and 100,000 Gazans have died. Now, there's
a difference between going in and raping and killing, what was it, 1,200 people?
Yeah.
On October 7th, There's, I guess, a difference between that and bombing indiscriminately with 2,000-pound bombs.
Not if you're the victim of Hamas or you're the victim of the bomb.
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly the same. It's horrible.
And the numbers are astounding. And I mean, to what extent does this start to look like that Israel has committed war crimes?
I think we're way past that. The Israelis have clearly committed war crimes, and the International Criminal Court has been slow to act on that, although they don't have a lot of teeth, and the U.S. doesn't help them do it.
Frank, you traveled with Tony Blinken to the region, right?
Yes.
So what is your take on our diplomats there?
As I said at the beginning, I think our diplomats work incredibly hard. There's the possibilities for a negotiated outcome have most of the time been pretty dim for reasons that we've just described. And so it takes a measure of idealism, willful optimism, indefatigability to be able to just keep on hammering away at this. And, could there have been something that they could have done that would have yielded a different outcome? We've discussed this a little bit already.
Right. Withholding weapons and bombs, et cetera, would have been at least a try, right?
That's one approach. I mean, I think I've been, in the course of doing this, I went back and I was rereading the Susan Glasser, Peter Baker biography of James Baker, George Packer's great biography of Richard Holbrooke, and just thinking about, in some instances, even the best, most earnest people are not as capable as the kind of the assholes or there's certain figures in American diplomatic history who can bring to bear creativity and willfulness and make something out of nothing. I'm not saying that was possible here, but these guys I have tremendous respect for, but they're not outsized personalities with a sense of their own historic destiny to break the template.
I would go a little further. Tony Blinken I've known for 30 years. Some of these other people I've known for 20 or 30 years. I consider them friends. I like them very much. I admire them enormously. I think they're very talented, serious diplomats.
No doubt.
A lot of the blame here has to go to Joe Biden. And I know it's not popular to say that right now. And frankly, I'm sort of in a moratorium of being critical of the administration until after the election.
Do you want us to delay airing this?
Yeah. But I'll put in the parenthetical here, by the way, that if all of this happened while Trump was president, it would have been 1,000 times worse. And it would go on, and there would be no constraints, and no one would even be talking about constraints. So it would be much, much worse. But Joe Biden's reaction to Israel and what our alliance is founded in a 1970s view of the relationship that was, sort of revealed when in the first days after October 7th, he kept talking about, well, I remember talking to Golda Meir. And it's like, Golda Meir is an unpopular Israeli prime minister who oversaw the last big security failure that took place there in the Yom Kippur War. And he is viewing Israel as this kind of the country that made the desert green, the country from Exodus, the country that was David against the Goliaths of the Arab world that we had to stand next to, and not the country that for the past 30, 40 years has been by far the strongest military power in the region, has been a bully, has done a bunch of things that are not good things, and that we need to have a bit more balance in our relationship with. And he's viewing Israel not in the context of an Israeli government that is extremist even for the extremes within Israel. The guys in the government, Ben Gvir was been, convicted of terrorism. I mean, these are terrible people. And so, you can support Israel without supporting the government as blindly as we did. And I think that was a mistake.
I'll say a couple things. One is, I think there's no doubt that Joe Biden's had a muddled view, a muddled policy in the course of this war, where you see it in the way in which there'll be goals or red lines that get established.
How long did he withhold the 2,000-pound bombs? Was that like Was that just a week or 2 weeks, or how long was that?
It was probably about 6 weeks, but I'm not totally certain.
That's it. That's kind of it,
But
right?
there's I mean, I think part of the problem is that I think Biden and I think the United States government, and there's pretty compelling national interest in doing so, agree with a lot of the interests, a lot of the end goals of the Israelis. They just disagree with their tactics. It's a stated goal to have Hamas dismantled. I think if we could have Hamas dismantled, that's something that we would applaud.
Do you think that we're just creating more Hamas in Gaza? I mean, that seems to be the kind of history of these kind of things, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a pretty good likelihood that that's the case.
Mm-hmm.
But and then there's this larger regional interest that we have.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the region. And since they killed the head of Hezbollah and then the next one and hopefully the next one, what does this do in terms of bringing Iran in? I mean, the whole region is now kind of involved. The Houthis in Yemen.
I mean, the whole region's been involved for a while. I mean, it was on October 8th. I think they could see the way in which everybody in the region suddenly shifted to a wartime footing where everybody was poised to fire on everybody else. And it may not seem like much of a victory because that war has now erupted. But I think one of the things that I think you could credit the administration, and again, this is a kind of a squinting of the eye type of achievement, is that they did keep the lid on for nearly a year. And it was a powder keg.
Is the lid on now?
But we don't know. We don't know. First of all, I think it's important to say Iran's been involved in this for a long, long time. They've set their own rules, right? They've said we have proxies that we're going to support, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and so forth. And we're going to keep stirring the pot, but please don't hit us at home. And so, they've been inviting a certain kind of a response for some time.
Are we expecting more of a response?
Well, I mean, they launched 180 missiles at Israel. Fortunately, I think only one person, a Palestinian gentleman, was killed. But having said that, we don't know what the next move is. And again, in Frank's squinting at the Middle East methodology here, which is, I think, the way you see as much good as you can, the Israelis have not immediately struck back at Iran. That's, probably due to just some U.S. pressure. But when they do, a whole set of new questions are going to be asked, right? Because if they strike at oil facilities or if they strike at nuclear facilities, it's going to be hard for Iran not to strike back in kind of scale. And I think there's a lot of discussion about, how do you get this math right so that you can strike back but not cause, greater regional conflagration. But I also think we have to keep in mind that Netanyahu for 25 years has been saying Iran is the existential threat and we ultimately have to destroy them. And so, that looms over this as well.
I mean, the other thing about Benjamin Netanyahu has an almost infinite number of faults, but one of them is not his impulsiveness. And that I think that he's somebody who tends to shrink in the face of big decisions. And you could see this throughout the last year that there were members of his war cabinet, not just the lunatics, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but people who were closer to the center of the Israeli polity who were arguing for preemptive war against Hezbollah. And Netanyahu was often on the side of the argument calling for applying the brakes in that situation, because for somebody who clings to dear political life, sometimes the threat of escalation is something that he perceives as being possibly undermining his political existence. So it's not totally clear to me which direction Israel is going to go.
Is that the case, though? Does escalation, I mean, doesn't he have more support in Israel now, today?
Yes,
he did before going into Lebanon and before taking out.
Israel was arguably losing. They had very, they could point in the direction of killing some leading members of Hamas, and they could point to dismantling Hamas's infrastructure. But in all likelihood, before this Lebanon war, the narrative was Israel had fought this long, costly war, and it still hadn't achieved the total victory that Netanyahu had promised. And then suddenly events shift to Lebanon, and Israel, which had been losing, starts to rack up these victories. And so that's what happens to wartime leaders. When things start to swing in their direction, they become more popular. But I think if he were to ignite an all-out war with Iran, it's a really costly proposition for Israel. And I'm not sure even Netanyahu would be willing to tolerate that, because he doesn't know where it would go for himself or his country.
How much do Americans care about this in terms of November 5th? And I mean, I just don't get the sense that Americans are in Michigan. I think didn't one of the Palestinian leaders who supported the uncommitted has now basically signaled that the best vote is for Harris. Do Palestinian Americans see that Trump would only be worse?
There is clearly a division. There was some movement of some groups to supporting the Harris campaign in the past week. There are still some other groups that are saying they want to support third-party candidates like Joe Stein. I think one of the things that has complicated this is that a lot of the folks in the Michigan community, particularly, are Lebanese. And so they have relatives in Lebanon. They have views about Lebanon. It does resonate there. If you have an election that could very well come down to a few thousand votes here and a few thousand votes there, this could be significant. And I know for a fact that the Harris campaign is devoting an enormous amount of resources towards speaking with these communities, trying to build ties, trying to have them get to know her better, and also trying to understand where Trump would bring this.
I was just reading Woodward's forthcoming book about
war.
What
is it good for?
What is it good for?
Absolutely nothing. Say it again.
When I talked to people within the administration, I wanted to see what differences existed between Harris and Biden on this issue. And clearly, at least rhetorically, she's expressed greater concern for civilian deaths. But I wanted to see if there were moments where she substantively disagreed with Biden about the policy itself. I actually couldn't find any in the course of my reporting, and I was looking for that, see if Woodward had found something that I couldn't. And indeed, he found in calls with Netanyahu, she would occasionally pipe up and say things about civilian casualties, but there wasn't really an actual substantive difference in policy. And so it kind of flashing forward a little bit, it's very hard to know exactly what her policy as it relates to the war
will hopefully be. We'll find out.
Well, I mean, in part, it's, there will be a very different set of facts on the ground when the next president takes over. And so I think understanding maybe tonally where they're at does provide some clue for what policy might be. And as David suggests, even if Harris represents some continuation with Biden, we know that Trump will present some sort of radical discontinuity that we can't be sure of because he's defined by being erratic.
Yeah, I would say this. Joe Biden is the president. Kamala Harris has been very careful to be deferential to that through the campaign. She can't promote an alternative Middle East policy while running for office. And although I've followed her very closely in this, and I've talked to her about it, I'm pretty sure that there will be differences of emphasis and tone in her policy. I don't think it would be radically different. I think she does actually believe in Israel's right to defend itself, for example. But having said that, I don't think that any president, possibly other than Trump, going forward, will ever treat the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu the same way that Biden did, because Biden got hosed. And Biden on a regular basis was Charlie Brown, and Netanyahu was Lucy in the football. And every single turn, Netanyahu took advantage of him and made him look bad because he wanted to make him look bad. And I also think, there was a very important point in the a difference of emphasis and tone from Harris took place in early December of last year when she was actually in the UAE for the COP28 meeting. And she gave a talk and then talked to a number of regional leaders in which she shifted her focus to the day after. What do we do after this war? And one of the reasons she did that was that when you do that, you say, well, the Palestinians need new leadership. Israel needs new leadership. There needs to be a political solution, and there needs to be some kind of peacekeeping solution, which isn't the Israelis, before you can get to rebuilding this and before you can move towards a two-state solution, which she very clearly expressed was the goal. I think, you need to look at that to see where she's going to try to direct her administration.
I mean, that is the core also of what Biden and Blinken, their vision for things as well. We can criticize whether they had the wherewithal to get to that vision, but starting even earlier than that, Blinken started to have conversations with the 5 Arab states about what a post-war would look like. And in the middle of this all, they put so much effort into reviving the Saudi normalization deal.
And that's still talked as a very strong possibility, but it all sort of depends on this war ending. Is that it?
Well, there's 2 things that it depends on. One is the war ending, and so that feels like a very distant prospect.
Presumably,
right now.
It's a part of ending the war.
Yeah, but Netanyahu also, even though Mohammed bin Salman doesn't really care that deeply about a Palestinian state, I think, especially as this war has dragged on and as the youth of his country have absorbed the war through TikTok, he realizes that he has to deliver something meaningful towards Palestinian statehood. And Netanyahu, even though in private has said many times he's willing to wordsmith something to get to what MBS wants, it still requires him to utter the words Palestinian state, which he chokes on every time they get close to passing his lip.
And no one in his government is for a Palestinian state, I take it.
No, but there are divisions within his government. I think Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, has been much more active behind the scenes working on what a post-war would look like. And I think he's come closer to articulating that there's going to need to be some sort of political solution with the Palestinians, which can only take the form of a path to Palestinian statehood, ultimately.
Doesn't it all sound very theoretical?
Yes.
David, I mean,
Yeah, no. I think it is theoretical because it's not Netanyahu's interest, nor is it the direction his government is heading, to promote or enable a new leadership among the Palestinians. They're still actively involved trying to sort of chop up the West Bank and take as much of it as possible. I think they just want this to go on for an indefinite period of time. If you don't have new Palestinian leadership and you don't have new Israeli leadership, and the Israelis are absolutely opposed to, peacekeeping solutions that don't involve them in some way, Gaza's going to remain an open wound for possibly years. And I think it's important to remember that in addition to the number of people who died there, the infrastructure has been obliterated. 40,000 plus homes or buildings have been destroyed. Gaza doesn't exist anymore.
I mean, the theoretical plan is, okay, ceasefire, then exchange the hostages for lots and lots of prisoners, and then an agreement, and then an international force comes in and the Saudis finance rebuilding Gaza, and Gaza and the West Bank become a Palestinian state. I just don't see that being able to happen.
You're correct to voice skepticism about the prospect of it, but there is no alternative.
Right.
I mean, the thing is, and it's what makes this whole effort so aching, is that it's so clear to the rest of the world kind of what the vision is. And there are a lot of problems with that vision, not just the ones that you described, but even the transitional ones. If Hamas still exists as a fighting force, who's going to want to send foreign troops in to secure Gaza? I don't think that there's a very easy explanation for that. Will the Saudis want to invest money in infrastructure that they could see would be potentially destroyed 6 months later when rockets start firing from Gaza at that point? it's really hard to see how we get beyond this war. But the vision is there. It's a lyrical vision, and I think if everybody could snap to their senses, it would, you could actually see a way in which the profound intellectual capital of the Palestinian people could be in a new reconstructed state. But it's just, I can't, it's so hard to see the steps that get us there.
The dark aspect of this whole thing is that your 20-second synopsis, Al, is the only way. And everybody knows it. That it's the only path forward.
Right.
So we can see it. We know what we've got to do. People get down to the nitty gritty. Well, Hamas has got to be gone, and Palestinian Authority has bad leadership. So here are 2 or 3 guys who should lead a renewed Palestinian Authority, and they go and move into this place. And people know how to do the steps. But if the Israeli government says, well, it's a ceasefire, except we can go in whenever we want to, which is their position, that's not a ceasefire. Or, there's peacekeeping, but we get to pick who it is. And these 3 places in Gaza we're going to be in charge of. That's not going to work.
And how do they get to there? And the theory of taking out what is it? Sinwar, who is their leader? Where is he? Is he in a tunnel surrounded by hostages, or
presumably?
Theoretically, yeah.
Sorry, I got you guys in. I've somehow steered the conversation into
the most impossible part of the whole discussion,
yes.
which is that you're insisting that there be a plausible bridge between the beautiful vision of what a post-war looks like in the ugly, sad reality of the present, and you're pushing on the weakness in all of these grand plans. Have you ever been involved in again, a truly authentically optimistic discussion about the Middle East?
No. Certainly not in the last year.
Yeah, well, it won't be for the next year or several years either, I think.
Okay, well, that sounds like a good note to end on.
Thanks, David.
Should we?
Should I have let you say that, Frank? I mean, are you more optimistic than that?
No, I'm not. I would have maybe just hedged my bet and said not in the coming months or not in the coming year, but coming years is probably the correct hedge.
Should I put a warning on the beginning of this podcast?
Or just
the following may bum you out.
A free Prozac bonus for your subscribers.
We can get them as a sponsor finally.
I will say one thing that's slightly optimistic, which is
good.
Kamala Harris's senior national security advisor, Phil Gordon, who is a longtime national security pro, wrote a book about the Middle East in which the sort of central thesis is American power is limited. And it's a very smart book, and he's not coming into it with the kind of delusional view towards the Middle East that a lot of people have. And if he ends up in a senior position and she is informed by the experience of the past few years, I would expect that there will be degrees of difference between how she handles it and how Biden handled it.
All right, I'll add. Can I add another maybe semi-optimistic layer, which is
please.
I do think that coming after October 7th, I think you see the traumatized Israeli electorate. You have Netanyahu existing in this coalition with some real far-right nutcases. But I do think that within the Israeli center-right, when I look at some of the potential successors to Netanyahu or challengers to Netanyahu, whether it's Gallant, the defense secretary, or Naftali Bennett, who was briefly prime minister, I do think that within maybe the sensible center-right, there's this sense that they've watched Netanyahu commit all of these strategic mistakes that have cost his country badly. And I think intellectually, at least, they're in a different place. And if there were a set of circumstances to bring them along to the type of deal that we're talking about, it's possible that intellectually they would have the wherewithal to get there. It's a question of whether they would. There's a courageous enough leader who could.
Where
emerge.
are the Israeli people on this? That is the missing piece that we haven't raised, which is where are the Israeli people right now?
Well, there's going back to October 6th, if you recall, there were these massive culture wars and political wars being fought within Israel over the future of the country, whether it was going to take a theocratic turn, an anti-democratic turn,
etc.
Yeah, and you see these debates over those debates have morphed into debates over the hostages, where you have these big demonstrations that take place in Tel Aviv and in the highways into Jerusalem, where they are demanding that the government take steps to release the hostages. So there is a division. I just think that as long as the country is actually in a state of war on multiple fronts.
And that's what seems to be the future, that more fronts. Is that right?
It's the reality today.
Yeah, the Israeli people are pretty divided because about half of the Israeli people see Netanyahu as a messianic threat to democracy. In some ways, it may be more than that. But the way that translates up into, their parliamentary system, Netanyahu's actually gained a couple of seats in the past couple of weeks. And that's why he's in a little bit of a stronger position. His majority is slightly larger. So, it is unlikely that you're going to see a major political shift in Israel. And, you were talking about, or Frank was talking about somebody on the center right stepping up. Well, it hasn't happened yet.
No, it has not.
There has not been a real, demonstration of leadership or cojones on the part of anybody to do that.
A lot of missed opportunities along the way.
So let's end on an optimistic note. No, that was. I think that could be the end.
I think Kamala Harris will win the election.
Well, that is boy.
And I think the outcomes for all of this will be better if she's president than if Donald Trump is president.
There you go.
He went out on a limb on the second part.
Well, I'm sorry, you guys, to lead you down this road, but I guess it was inevitable once I started what I started.
Thanks,
so
Al.
I think people need this kind of conversation, or is it a conversation that just is the sort of logical extension of where we are?
We need to be able to have this kind of conversation on its merits without a chorus of people saying your analysis is anti-government of Israel and therefore it's anti-Semitic, or your analysis is, anti-Palestinian, et cetera, et cetera. Too much of this discussion is colored now in culture war in the United States, and that doesn't help it.
Okay, that's right. That's right. Well, I think we had a good discussion. I think a helpful one. And I want to thank you guys for that.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening. That beautiful music is by Leo Kottke, the great Leo Kottke. I want to thank Peter Ogburn for producing this podcast. We'll talk again next week.